Since I was very young, every summer, I used to take the same 6-hour car trip to a cabin owned by one of my uncles near a lake. Over the years, it became a tradition for my mother's family to visit the cabin during the summer like a mini family vacation. It was always enjoyable, spending time with my cousins, and I was close to some of them. The only part I didn't like was the car journey. As I grew older, got a job and moved out of my parents' house, I began making the trip alone each year. As mentioned before, the 6-hour drive might not seem like much, but when you're driving alone for that long without anything to distract your mind, it feels like an eternity. Anyway, this story happened when I was driving to the annual gathering at my uncle's cabin. I usually tried to make the trip during the day, but that year, my boss had me working 2 consecutive shifts right before the journey. I left work very late, and the family was expecting me at the cabin the next morning, forcing me to drive at night, something I wasn't thrilled about. The road I was on for most of the trip wasn't very busy even during the day, and at night it was even less so. It cut through a dense forest with closely packed trees. Usually, I could complete the entire trip without stopping, but this time, I had no choice. I was halfway there when I realized my fuel was running out. This infuriated me, since I had lent my car to my brother while at work, and he had assured me he would refuel before returning it. So he either forgot or lied to me. I started paying attention to the signs on the side of the road, trying to locate a gas station. Checking the car's gauge, I saw I was close to running out of gas. I didn't have the luxury of picking the best gas station. I planned to stop at the first one I saw, regardless of anything else. A few minutes later, I finally saw a sign for a gas station at the next exit. However, it wasn't an official road sign. It was literally a homemade wooden sign someone had stuck in the ground. Spray painted on it were the words, "Gas station ahead." It was a bit odd, but people make similar signs for those roadside fruit stands that sell fruit, so I shrugged off the strangeness of the sign, turned at the next exit, but saw nothing immediately. I kept driving until the asphalt suddenly turned into a dirt road. Eventually, with the headlights, I identified a gas station on the right side of the road, but I quickly realized the place looked completely abandoned, as if it had been closed for several years. The gas pumps were removed, most windows were broken, and the roof was on the verge of collapsing. There was no way I could get gas here. Looking at my car's gauge, I figured I could probably only drive for another 2 kilometers. I had essentially given up at that point. I called my insurance to request a tow truck, described my location as best as I could, turned off the car, and waited. I didn't expect them to arrive quickly. After all, I was basically in the middle of nowhere. All I could do was sit and wait. So that's exactly what I did. 30 minutes passed in that situation. Only then did my eyes truly adjust to the darkness I was in, and I began really observing that abandoned gas station from inside my car. I don't know if my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I swear I could see movement inside the station. I started to panic slightly, knowing I couldn't cover much distance with my car if there was any threat nearby. I kept my eyes fixed on the gas station, trying to convince myself there was nothing there, that I was wrong. That's when a distant voice shouted, almost in a whisper, "Hey, buddy, come here." I'd left my windows slightly open to avoid the car getting too stuffy, so I could hear the voice perfectly. My gaze immediately turned in the direction of the voice. There was a figure in the darkness standing next to the gas station. I was paralyzed, and the sound of my heart was so loud I could clearly hear it. After a few seconds, the figure began walking toward my car, but I was simply frozen, feeling like I couldn't move. When he got close enough to the passenger side window, he whispered into the car, "Hey, do you need gas?" Now that he had approached the car, I could finally see some of his appearance despite the darkness. He was wearing winter clothes and seemed to be a homeless person. Very hesitantly I replied, yeah, I need gas." He then explained that he had gas in a container inside the station and was willing to give it to me for free without charging anything. All I had to do was get out of the car and follow him. After a few seconds of that proposal, I simply said, "No." I didn't know what else to say. There was no way I was leaving the safety of my locked car to enter an abandoned gas station with this guy. The man didn't react after my short and rude response. He had a slight smile before, but now it had disappeared. He just stood there, totally rigid, with an empty and somewhat frustrated expression. This uncomfortable situation continued for another full minute, but I didn't want to say anything more. That's when I heard the best sound I could hear at that moment. I heard the sound of the tow truck's tires on the dirt road. The man's head immediately turned towards the tow truck, and he quickly ran toward the gas station, then disappeared into the forest. As he did that, I saw what was probably the most disturbing sight I had ever witnessed in my life. I saw what looked like at least 8 silhouettes of people in the darkness who were hiding and stood up from behind the bushes in front of the station, also running towards the forest when the tow truck arrived. These were people who undoubtedly were waiting for me to exit the car to get that supposed free gas. A few seconds passed, and the tow truck driver approached my window with a confused expression on his face. The tow truck driver was big, at least 6'5", and at least 250 pounds. He asked if I was the one who had called the insurance for gas. I said yes, and then he asked who those people were who had run into the forest. I proceeded to explain the entire situation to him and told him how frightening it had been. Upon hearing the story, he offered to call the police from the nearest town, which he did. But he filled my car with gas, and I left before the police arrived. However, the next day, I was informed by phone that none of those people had been found. That night has haunted my thoughts ever since. The strange man who spoke to me was clearly trying to lure me into some kind of trap. But what could be the purpose of this trap? I just don't know. However, it must be admitted that it would probably be something horrible. I was on a completely empty dirt road in the middle of the forest, miles away from any house or town. What was about to happen to me certainly wasn't good, and I also can't understand why there were so many people there in the darkness at an abandoned gas station near the forest. The only thing I know is how grateful I am that the tow truck arrived when it did. If it hadn't come at the right time, who knows what would have happened. This story happened a few years ago. It was some day in July, and I decided on a last-minute, improvised, day-long road trip. I love visiting tourist spots, and there were some nearby that I really wanted to see before heading back to college in August. The plan was to wake up early, hit the road, visit a few places during the day, and then start the journey back home around 9 in the evening. I thought this way, I could optimize my time without having to pay for a hotel room or anything. The outbound journey was smooth, but on the way back the story took a different turn. I began the return trip at 10 in the evening. The GPS estimated it would take 4 hours to get home. I'd covered half the distance and was starting to get tired. I was so tired that it was becoming dangerously difficult to continue driving. So I told myself that at the next rest stop I saw, I would pull over to take a 1-hour nap. That way I could still make it home in a reasonable time. So I did just that. I spotted a place where I could stop, entered, and parked in the lot. The first thing I noticed was the lack of cars. The place was completely empty, and if it weren't for the lights, I would have thought it was abandoned. But it made sense. After all, it was already quite late. Anyway, I reclined my seat and set my phone alarm for 1 hour. An hour later, the alarm went off. I woke up, still tired, with watery eyes. but I was a bit less exhausted than before and ready to continue the journey. I almost started the car to keep going, but as I touched the key to start the engine, I realized I really needed to use the restroom. I got out of the car and headed towards the entrance of the place. I opened the entrance door, went in, found the restroom, and entered one of the stalls. I'd only been in the restroom for about 30 seconds when suddenly I heard someone talking in the corridor outside. This startled me because I hadn't heard the entrance door of the place open. And after all, I hadn't seen another car besides mine a few minutes ago. I couldn't understand how there could be another person besides me inside this place. And then the bathroom door opened. I was a little nervous, but I calmed down, realizing it was probably just a regular person I hadn't noticed before. I was about to leave when suddenly I heard light knocks on the stall door. Where I was, uncomfortably, I said, "Excuse me, this stall is occupied." There was no response, complete silence. I was a bit nervous now, so I decided I would stay inside the stall until that person left. That's when I noticed an eye watching me through the crack of the stall door. When we made eye contact, the man started screaming and frantically banging his head against the stale door. With adrenaline coursing through my body, I used all my strength to slam into the door, opening it violently and knocking the man to the floor. I started running as fast as I could out of the bathroom and out of that place, not looking back towards my car. I was almost at my car when I heard the entrance door of that place violently open behind me. The man was really chasing me. Finally, I reached my car and desperately started the engine, but the man caught up and managed to throw his body against my car until I accelerated, knocking him to the ground. Breathing heavily and terrified, I looked in the rearview mirror as I drove away. I saw the man getting up as if nothing had happened, and then he just stood there, staring in my direction. I was more than just shaken. I couldn't even process what had happened. Honestly, I didn't know what to think. You always hear crazy stories like this on TV or in the newspaper, but you never think something like that could actually happen to you. I drove well above the speed limit for the rest of the way home. And needless to say, I was no longer taking any risks of falling asleep at the wheel after what had happened. I was completely filled with adrenaline. I still have no idea who that man was, where he came from, or what his problem was. But if I had to guess, I'd say he was some homeless man who just wasn't right in the head. But even then, what kind of homeless person would be practically in the middle of nowhere, near the road at night? None of it made sense. All I know is that I never stopped my car at unknown rest stops along the road again, and I plan to keep doing that for the rest of my life. Every year, during the holiday season, my entire family used to come together to collectively contribute and rent a huge house in some new location so that everyone could spend the festive dates together. I always liked this tradition, and every year I eagerly awaited the holidays. In a particular year, my family had chosen the city where they would rent a house. The city was a few hours' drive from my college, so I decided to drive there alone. I would usually opt for flying, but I wanted to have my car there since renting a car for an extended period tends to be quite expensive. The road trip would take a total of 8 hours, with the majority of the journey on a road passing through the middle of a desert. After 5 hours of driving, it had already become completely dark. I could only see things directly illuminated by my car's headlights. It was a bit eerie, but relaxing at the same time. It's hard to explain the feeling. You would have to take the same road at night to understand what I'm talking about. Anyway, about an hour later, I started noticing a car that had been behind me for a few hours. However, when you're on a single stretch of road in the middle of the desert, it's not uncommon for a car to follow you for a few hours. After all, it could just be heading to the same city as me. But this time, I felt something odd. I began to realize that the car was getting closer and closer to my bumper. It literally got so close that sometimes it seemed like it was just a few inches away from hitting my car before pulling back again. And then it would repeat and get close again. This went on for quite some time, and the more it happened, the more uncomfortable I became. To be honest, I was really starting to get scared. If this car just wanted to go faster than me, it could have overtaken me hours ago. This situation continued repeating for even more time when suddenly I saw a police car parked on the side of the road. I considered the option of stopping the car, but a part of me thought I was just being too paranoid about the situation. Anyway, I ended up deciding to stop the car anyway. I parked near the police officer and let the car pass. Then the officer asked me if I needed anything. I told him everything that had happened. I also mentioned that I might just be overly paranoid. But surprisingly, he took my story very seriously. He told me that it was not uncommon for cars to be stolen on these more desolate roads. He then offered to follow me, perhaps as a way to make me feel safer. Obviously, I accepted his offer, so off we went, covering the rest of the way. Only a few minutes passed, and suddenly I started seeing something that left me frozen with fear. In the darkness ahead, I saw that car that had been following me, now patiently waiting by the side of the road. As soon as it saw the police officer following me, it started the car and sped off in the opposite direction. Shortly after, the officer stopped following me and turned the car around. Then he turned on the siren and began pursuing that car. I was alone again. In the end, the officer's suspicions were correct. For what other reason would that car have waited for me? And an even better question, why would it have fled upon seeing the police? I still have no idea if that car was caught or if it managed to escape. I didn't get to ask the officer's name, but whoever he is, I am extremely grateful to him. I still think about what would have happened if I hadn't followed my intuition and hadn't stopped to talk to that police officer. In the video description, there are links to horror and thriller books in case you want to buy. And if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.